Hi, I'm Jack. Welcome back to my channel and another video. I'm going to be doing a review today for the original Exorcist from 1973. And for those who don't know, this story is about this young girl called Regan, and her behaviour starts to become very unusual. And after her and her mum exhaust all medical possibilities, they end up contacting some priests thinking that she might be possessed. So this movie, for the longest time, this is a 50-year-old film now, has always had that slogan associated with it of the scariest movie of all time. And you know, if you look up on any list, top 10 most scary films, scariest horror film ever made, you won't have to search far before you find The Exorcist being mentioned. And watching this film today, if you go in with those expectations, I think most people, most fans of horror, will be very disappointed now. Coming into it this time, watching it from a different perspective, I have to say, this time around, I genuinely really enjoyed The Exorcist. I think it's a really well written film. I think it's a really well directed film. It's got a lot of very interesting elements about it. So, you know, because I really see this now as more of a drama. It's very much a character story. And a drama. It's a slow burn drama. So if you come into it with those expectations, I actually think this is a movie that you'll get a lot from. There are definitely some things about it that still hold up in terms of the horror. I think the performance from Linda Blair is absolutely incredible. She really carries this film, and being only a 12 or 13-year-old actress when she did this is pretty impressive. You know, if you read a bit about The Exorcist, you'll see that a lot of actresses were kind of called for the role, but for various reasons, understandably, a lot of the parents of kind of known young actresses weren't happy with them starring in it because the script was so dark and disturbing. So when they finally found Linda Blair, they obviously found a perfect match, and she is really amazing here. She's genuinely disturbing. This is something that doesn't actually feel tame even by now. Her performance, some of the lines she has to come out with, and some of the things she has to act out are pretty disturbing. I mean, I do get as well that, you know, some of the very explicit scenes were done by a slightly older actress. But, you know, a lot of the stuff where it's her in the makeup, interacting with her mum, the priests, everything like that, it's pretty crazy stuff. So that really does hold up quite well. And again, it's just seeing that contrast between where you first meet Regan as a character and she's kind of the most sweet, innocent girl, and what she turns into, like her descent and what she turns into by the end. It's pretty shocking, even by today's standards. I think on top of that as well, there's also a couple of hospital scenes where she first starts to be diagnosed, or these medical people are trying to work out what might be wrong with her, going through MRIs and various scans and tests, stuff like that. And there again, like something about the atmosphere of them. They are quite chilling to watch. I think those kind of scenes are where the film's horror aspects are definitely the most effective, rather than when it gets into the sort of, you know, full-on possession stuff. Just because of by now, you know, 50 years on, we've just seen so much of it, and realistically now done a lot better. So in terms of a lot of the stuff here, it does still hold up, just not so much in terms of the actual scares themselves. I really quite like the way the characters are developed here as well, especially Damien Karras. And I didn't really remember much about him from the first time that I saw this, but watching this again, I actually really liked him as a character, and I liked the story he was given here, where he's this priest who's having this kind of crisis of faith. At the same time that his mum, he feels like he wasn't there for his mum as she was dying, and just various other stresses in his job have just made him starting to question how he feels about faith. And he's also a psychiatrist, so he comes from a kind of position of science as well. And I found that quite an interesting thing about his character. There was quite a lot of depth there, and I like that he starts to find some focus and find a way of helping someone when he encounters Chris, when she tells the story about Regan and how she actually reaches out to help from him. And I really just like how they played out his character. And obviously it's quite a heartbreaking end as well, where he effectively sacrifices himself to save Regan. So I think overall as a character, he was someone I really liked and kind of found myself quite invested in. So, you know, the film is a slow build, but just the way the character dynamics work. A lot of the conversations feel authentic to me, feel real, and I was very engaged in it throughout. So that was something that really impressed me about The Exorcist, watching it again this time around. I do actually remember this being a lot more heavy-handed with all of the Christian and religious elements than it actually is. I mean, obviously to some extent they are going on religious themes here. You know, it is really about how it's effectively about Christianity overcoming this possession in the end. But the way I remembered it was with all the scientists and the medical professionals, that they were kind of seen as these people that just couldn't see reason, even though you could see this girl was clearly in a very bad way. And it wasn't actually like that at all. A lot of the interactions between the mum and the people in the medical profession felt very legitimate to me. You know, the way they were discussing it, and even the way, again, Scariest discusses it with her, that the reason they couldn't find anyone to do an exorcism there is that because of the advances in science and understanding mental health and personality disorders, that exorcism was no longer a practice that was really done there at all. And I thought that was quite interesting for them to have a priest character kind of discussing these things in that way, despite that feeling that you get from the film that the themes of the story are really about religion, because obviously William Peter Blatty himself was a very devout religious person. So you can definitely still see that here, but I do like the kind of the balance between science and religion, the way they show this in the film. And it's easy to see why as well. Probably, you know, back in the 70s when it was a much more religious time, you know, especially in the US, I can imagine that then this film would have been a lot more controversial, kind of touching a nerve with more people who kind of have a faith and have a religious background. So it's definitely a film that would have probably been more effective for the more horror aspects of its story it was telling in its time. Whereas now, I mean, especially where I'm from in England, you know, people aren't particularly religious anymore. So this film just doesn't touch a nerve, I suspect, with people in the same way that it would have back in the 1970s. I love the effects and the practical makeup work they've done on Regan as well. She does still look very creepy. I think, you know, as you've seen a lot of the pictures online of her, there's something about her face that she brings a real kind of like emptiness to her eyes, and all of the makeup and seeing these scars and bulges all over this young girl's face. You can't deny that it is a little bit chilling still to see her. Even now, it wasn't as laughable as I thought it was going to be. I thought looking back at these old effects, it was going to look really sort of dated. But no, to be fair, I do think it actually does look very good. And on top of that as well, one interesting thing was the actor Max von Sydow, who of course is the first priest we're introduced at the start. Is it Father Merrin, I think is his name in the film. And I remember having seen this actor in kind of recent films before he died, and I thought, wow, this guy looked so old here. Like he looks like he's been in his 70s for like 50 years, and found out after that actually he was only 40 when this film was released, and they'd actually just done all of this kind of makeup to him. But it was really quite impressive. You know, he genuinely came across, even just in his mannerisms, the way he walked and talked and everything, like he really was this old priest, this old wise priest. So they did a really quite amazing job there with all the kind of makeup skills and stuff. There's certainly some things about this that haven't aged well, I don't think. The finale for me is a bit anticlimactic. I think once you get the two priests there and they begin to perform this exorcism on Regan, I start to feel that scene dragging on for a little bit too long. I think in terms of a possession scene, because we've seen so many of them done and quite a lot better now, especially when you think of films like The Conjuring, this does feel very tame in comparison. And it does end up feeling like you're spending 20 minutes just in a room with flashing lights watching these old guys throw holy water over Regan. So it definitely doesn't have the tension, and it doesn't instill the fear in me at all now, the way it may have some people back in the day. So I definitely think some of the effect of that scene has been lost. And on top of that as well, I think in terms of some of the editing of the film, it does have some pacing issues. Not from the perspective that it's too long. I don't mind that it's a slow film. I actually quite like that about it. And I did find myself actually enjoying the build-up more than the actual climax of the film. But there's certain scenes in here that are too long, I think, and unnecessarily long for the story they're trying to tell. But then there's other moments where I could really have done with more information, where it feels like they just sort of skimmed quickly over certain things. So you have the scene at the start with the archaeological dig, when you're introduced to this Father Merrin, and it's a very long, drawn-out scene, and it doesn't really establish a right lot. You have the uncovering, or the discovery of this demonic statue, and that is really about it. There's no dialogue, or not much of it anyway, in this first scene. It kind of, and you're just kind of there left thinking like, what's this all about? I don't really understand what I'm supposed to be following in this scene. So I think that was an unnecessarily long intro. But then you have other scenes where later on you have the death of Chris's or her friend, the one that makes the documentaries with her. He's fallen out of a window, and there's kind of a case being raised about the suspicion of how it happened. But I feel like it just kind of quickly jumps over this scene. You don't even realise that he's died. I couldn't even really remember how he was related to Chris. So it's moments like that could have been fleshed out way more. So I started to notice certain problems with some of the editing in that regard. Certain things as well, like with, I don't feel like always we're perceiving the descent of Regan the same way that the characters in the story are. So you have Father Karras, where Chris first gets in touch with him and kind of tells him about these problems that she's had and how bad it's got. And by this point, they've kind of gone through a lot of these medical procedures, and he wants to just approach this from a psychiatrist's point of view, because that's who he is mainly. And by the time you see Regan here, like, she's going to need more than an hour of therapy when you see the state of her by this point. And the way he kind of just talks about it, like, oh, we need to look into more medical procedures. It's kind of like, within the context of the film, it just comes across a bit ridiculous to me, a bit unintentionally funny now, when you see scenes like that. So it's things like that where I feel like the transition between her being a normal girl to unusual behaviour to full-on possessed demon doesn't necessarily match up with the way the characters in the story are experiencing this. Overall, though, it's a very interesting film. I'm really glad to go back and see this and kind of gain a bit of a new appreciation again from it. Again, not just as a horror film, but just as a film in general. As I said, if you go in with those expectations, no longer expecting scariest movie ever, and just enjoy it for what it is. I do think there's quite a lot to get out of this film. It's very interesting, well-developed characters, and quite an intriguing story. So it's definitely a film I'd recommend. I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 5 rating. Thank you very much for watching my video. Please do leave your comments down below on what you think of The Exorcist. I'd love to hear as well if you saw this back in the day, and if you can kind of tell me a bit about how the reactions to it would be way different to how they would be now. I find that very interesting about this film, just because, it's lasted the test of time. People still talk about it now, so it's interesting to see that change in it over the years. But do let me know all your thoughts on that down in the comments.